Jayom Vishnupad Paramhansa Paribrajakacharyastu Tarasata Shishimad A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Ananta Koti Vaishnavrinda Ki Jai. Namacharya Srila Haridas Thakur Ki Jai. Prem Sikoho Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shivas Arigor Bhaktavrinda Ki Jai. Shri Shri Radha Krishna Gopa Gopinatha Shama Kunda Radha Kunda Giri Govardhan Ki Jai. Shri Vrindavan Dham Ki Jai. Mayapur Dham Ki Jai. Jagannath Puri Ki Jai. Ganga Mai Ki Jai. Jamuna Mai Ki Jai. Tulsi Maharani Ki Jai. Bhakti Devi Ki Jai. Samaveda Bhaktavrinda Ki Jai. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to Shri Shri Guru and Gauranga. All glories to Srila Prabhupada. Today we're continuing with the reading of Srila Prabhupada Lilamrita, Volume 2, by His Holiness Satsrup Das Goswami. And we'll also be hearing excerpts from Mukunda Goswami's book entitled Miracle on Second Avenue. So Srila Prabhupada has been in America now for 1 year, almost 1 year. And within that time, he moved to 5 different places in 1 year. Now finally at 26 Second Avenue, Prabhupada has attracted some young people who are becoming dedicated to his teachings, very attached to him, and attending his morning and evening classes. And one of them who actually offered to assist Prabhupada, because previously Prabhupada was cooking for all of the young men every day. Some of the young men would eat up to 11 chapatis a day. And Prabhupada was doing all that cooking. So Keith, who later became Kirtanananda, he offered to assist Prabhupada, and he learned from Prabhupada how to cook. Keith was cooking lunch in the kitchen as usual, but today Swamiji was standing by the kitchen stove, watching his pupil. Keith paused and looked up from his cooking. "Swamiji, could I become your disciple?" "Yes," Prabhupada replied. "Why not? Your name will be Krishna Das." This simple exchange was the first request for discipleship and Prabhupada's first granting of initiation. But there was more to it than that. Prabhupada announced that he would soon hold an initiation. "What's initiation, Swamiji?" one of the boys asked. And Prabhupada replied, "I will tell you later." So now we have a very organized institution of International Society for Krishna Consciousness. Before taking initiation, you have to take a disciple course, and you have to choose who your guru will be, get his permission, and we have to take lifetime vows of the 4 regulative principles and chanting minimum of 16 rounds of Harekrishna mantra every day. But at this time, none of these young boys had a clue what initiation actually meant. Prabhupada did not even tell them about the 4 regulative principles, nor did he tell them about the bare rock minimum of 16 rounds a day. In fact, because Kirtanananda or Keith and Howard had gone to India previously, they understood the process of initiation, but they didn't understand what, from their side, their commitment would have to be. First, they had to have beads. Keith went to Tandy's Leather Company and bought 1/2-inch wooden beads and cord to string them on. It was much better, Swamiji said, to count on beads while chanting, a strand of 108 beads to be exact. This employed the sense of touch, and like the Vaishnavas of India, one could count how many times one chanted the mantra. Some devotees in India had a string of more than 1,000 beads, he had said, and they would chant through them again and again. He taught the boys how to tie a double knot between each of the 108 beads. The number 108 had a special significance. There were 108 Upanishads, as well as 108 principal gopis, the chief devotees of Lord Krishna. So before this time, the devotees didn't have any beads at all. Srila Prabhupada had japa beads. They would see Prabhupada chanting on his beads. They saw that he had a little bag that he kept them in, but they couldn't understand that they also would have to have beads in order to take initiation. And in America at that time, there was no such thing as tulsi plants. So there were no tulsi beads. And therefore, the closest thing to what Prabhupada had of his beads was these wooden beads that were made in different colors. So the devotees decided amongst themselves that they would get some nice big red beads, 1/2 inch each, and string them. And Prabhupada taught them. You can see here in Vrindavan, of course, the Tulsi Wallas, they're stringing the beads and they have the long strings and everything. So Prabhupada taught them how to do that. They would tie it onto a doorknob or onto a heater, something so that they could push the beads and then make the knot, push the beads. And all of us, we made our own beads before initiation. The initiates would be taking vows, he said, and one vow would be to chant a prescribed number of rounds on the beads each day. About a dozen of Swamiji's boys were eligible, but there was no strict system for their selection. If they wanted to, they could do it. So even in the prayers to the 6 Goswamis, the Sad Goswami Astakam, there's mention there that the 6 Goswamis used to have regulated number of rounds that they would chant. So this is the system within the Gaudiya Vaishnavas, that you take a vow to chant a certain number of rounds. For instance, later Prabhupada will tell the devotees that Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, he insisted upon 64 rounds. And he said that anyone who does not chant 64 rounds, they're considered fallen. But these boys were not ready for 64 rounds. They didn't even chant 1 round yet because they didn't have beads. So we'll see how Prabhupada introduces this. Now Steve later became Satsvarup, who has written this book. Although I was already doing whatever Swamiji recommended, I sensed that initiation was a heavy commitment. And with my last strong impulses to remain completely independent, I hesitated to take initiation. So at this time, although Satsvarup Maharaj wrote this classic book of Prabhupada's biography, the Srila Prabhupada Lilamrita, he had Prabhupada's whole lifetime to cover, and he was able to do that in 7 volumes. But he couldn't go into great detail, especially about his own personal relationship with Prabhupada. So Satsvarup Maharaj wrote many, many books and poems describing his interactions with Prabhupada, his realizations, and his purification as he was associating with Prabhupada. So in his reflections at this time, we'll read in the next coming frame, how we'll read that. Prabhupada's friends saw the initiation in different ways. Some saw it as very serious, and some took it to be like a party or a happening. While stringing their beads in the courtyard, Wali, who later became Umapati, and Howard, who became Hayagriva, talked a few days before the ceremony. Wali, it's just a formality. You accept Swamiji as your spiritual master. Just as if you have a teacher in a class, you have to accept the teacher as your instructor. So while he saw just like that Prabhupada was instructing them, of course they didn't call him Prabhupada then, he was Swamiji, he was instructing them in spiritual life, and it was a formality only. Howard, what does it entail? Wali, nobody's very sure. In India, it's a standard practice. Don't you think you want to take him as a spiritual master? Howard, I don't know. He would seem to be a good spiritual master, whatever that is. I mean, I like him and his teachings a lot. So I guess in a way he's already my spiritual master. I just don't understand how it would change the situation. And Wali replies, neither do I. I guess it doesn't. It's just a formality. So Howard and Keith, they had gone to India searching for a guru or a spiritual master, and they were disappointed and disillusioned. The wild-haired, bearded gurus that they met couldn't communicate with them. They didn't know English, and they couldn't understand what they were, the boys couldn't understand what they were teaching. And the ones who could speak English seemed to be more business-oriented. So they couldn't find the guru they were looking for, although they searched around India. So they came back to America disappointed. And then that was when Howard met Prabhupada walking on the street. So they were aware of the guru-disciple relationship. And since Howard, by this time, it had only been July, August, and now it was September, just before Janmashtami time, 3 months he had been hearing Prabhupada twice a day. And in one respect, he had already accepted Prabhupada as his instructor. So now they had to get it clarified from Prabhupada what it actually meant to accept initiation. September 8th, Janmashtami Day, the appearance day of Lord Krishna. So the year before, Srila Prabhupada, he was on the boat in the Jaladuta. He was docked in the Cochin port, and he observed Janmashtami with all the crew members of the boat. So now 1 year later, Prabhupada has now accepted, ready to accept, the next day he will accept his first 11 disciples in America. 1 year before, Prabhupada observed Krishna's birthday at sea aboard the Jaladuta, just out of Colombo. No, not Colombo, it was Cochin. This is a mistake here. Now, exactly 1 year later, he had a small crew of harekrishna chanters. He would gather them all together, have them observe a day of chanting, reading, scripture, fasting, and feasting. And the next day would be initiation. At 6 o'clock, Prabhupada came down and was about to give his morning class as usual, when one of the boys asked if he would read from his own manuscript. Prabhupada appeared shy, yet he did not hide his pleasure at having been asked to read his own Bhagavad-Gita commentary. Usually he would read a verse from Dr. Radhakrishnan's Oxford edition of the Gita. Although the commentary presented impersonalist philosophy, the translations, Prabhupada said, were 90% accurate. But this morning, he sent Roy up to fetch his manuscript, and for an hour he read from its typed written pages. So normally Prabhupada would have the boys in a rather informal way. They would read the translation of each Bhagavad-Gita sloka, and Prabhupada would give a lecture, usually a half an hour, sometimes an hour, on that sloka. Now, one of the boys is asking to hear Prabhupada's own manuscript, which he was preparing for printing. So he was both honored, but he appeared shy, and he sent one of his students named Roy, who used to be a writer for comic books, but he knew something about editing and about publishing. So he sent Roy up to get the manuscript, and he began reading from those pages. For observing Janmashtami, there were special rules. There should be no eating, and the day was to be spent chanting, reading, and discussing Krishna consciousness. If anyone became too weak, he said, there was fruit in the kitchen, but better that they fast until the feast at midnight, just like the devotees in India. He said that in India, millions of people, Hindus, Muslims, or whatever, observed the birthday of Lord Krishna, and in every temple there were festivities and celebrations of the pastimes of Krishna. And now, he said at length, I will tell you what is meant by initiation. Initiation means that the spiritual master accepts the student and agrees to take charge, and the student accepts the spiritual master and agrees to worship him as God. He paused. No one spoke. Any questions? And there were none. He got up, and when there were none, he got up and walked out. So Prabhupada all along had been telling the devotees that God is God, and we're just part and parcel of the Supreme Lord. And now he's saying that after initiation, you worship your guru as God. So the boys became confused. The devotees were stunned. What had they just heard him say? For weeks he had stressed that when anyone claims to be God, he should be considered as dog. The two words, G-O-D, and the opposite of that is D-O-G. So anyone who claims to be God, Prabhupada said they were like dog. My mind's just been blown, said Wally. Everyone's mind is blown, said Howard. Swamiji just dropped the bomb. They thought of Keith. He was wise. Consult Keith. But Keith was in the hospital. Now, how did Keith get in the hospital? Keith had an idea that if he went to the welfare department as a devotee and he asked for welfare because he didn't have a job, he didn't have any income, then he would be able to get money to support the temple. So he went to the welfare department and dressed up as a devotee. He was the first one to shave up and put on a dhoti. And he told them, I don't have any money, I don't have any job, I need some welfare. So the officer asked him, who told you to come here? And Keith said, God told me to come here. So the officer said, just wait a minute. He picked up the phone and he said, there's someone here who talks to God, and I think you should come over right away and take care of him. So what the officer did was he called the insane asylum, which is called Bellevue Hospital, and they came and picked him up and put him in the crazy house. So it wasn't exactly a hospital. So they went to see him there at Bellevue. But Keith was in the hospital. Talking among themselves, they became more and more confused. Swamiji's remark had confounded their judgment. Finally, Wally decided to go to the hospital to see Keith. Keith listened to the whole story, how Swamiji had told them to fast, and how he had read from his manuscript, and how he had said he would explain initiation, and how everybody had leaned forward, all ears, and Swamiji had dropped the bomb. The student accepts the spiritual master and agrees to worship him as God. Any questions? Swamiji had asked softly, and then he had walked out. I don't know if we want to be initiated now, Wally confessed. We have to worship him as God? Well, you're already doing that by accepting whatever he tells you, Keith replied. And he advised them to talk it over with Swamiji before the initiation, which is going to be the next day. So Wally went back to the temple and consulted Howard, and together they went up to Swamiji's apartment. "Does what you told us this morning," Howard asked, "mean we are supposed to accept the spiritual master to be God?" Now, Prabhupada's reply, "That means he is due the same respect as God, being God's representative," Prabhupada replied calmly. "Then he is not God?" "No," Prabhupada said, "God is God. The spiritual master is his representative. Therefore, he is as good as God because he can deliver God to the sincere disciple. Is that clear?" It was. So Prabhupada gives the example of an ambassador. We have so many ambassadors who come and they reside in the embassies in Chanakapuri here in Delhi. So the ambassador, he's the representative of that country. And when you communicate with the ambassador, you're communicating with the country that he represents. So in the same way, with our spiritual master, as the representative of God, we communicate with the Supreme Lord through the via medium of the spiritual master. So this is what Prabhupada now clarified to his young students. It was a mental and physical strain to go all day without eating. Jan was restless. Now we have in this book the behind the scenes of this day, the first time they had to fast. Yes, here it is. Okay. We'll read first what's in the Lilamrita, and then we'll read what the kids actually went through that day. They couldn't do it. And I can tell you confidentially, on Janmashtami here in Vrindavan, you have to understand that Prabhupada, he would translate all night. And then as we went to Mangalarti, Prabhupada would come down from see this door, it goes right to Prabhupada's upstairs room where he would translate. He would come down, go on a morning walk, come back, give a morning class, deal with management and answering letters all day. Then in the evening time, he would come again and give a class. So to have to give 2 classes a day and to fast is very difficult, especially for an elderly person in their late 70s. So Srila Prabhupada, you know, there's peta. Yes. And there's something called anguri peta. You know what anguri? It's wet peta. So sometimes Prabhupada would call in on Janmashtami and he would take some of this anguri peta, and sometimes he would take misri water. That's the misri that's been dissolved in the water, and drink that. Just enough so that he could have energy to give 2 classes in one day. So it's not that we torture ourselves. Prabhupada said here that if necessary, if they couldn't fast, they could go up and have some fruit. So it was a mental and physical strain to go all day without eating. Jan, remember, she became Janaki. She's the elder sister of Jamuna, and she was the partner, let's say, engaged to Michael, who became Mukunda. She complained that she couldn't possibly stay any longer, but had to go take care of her cat. Prabhupada tried to overrule her, but she left anyway. Most of the prospective initiates spent several hours that day stringing their shiny red wooden beads. Having tied one end of the string to a window bar or a radiator, they would slide one bead at a time up the string and knot it tightly, chanting one mantra of harekrishna for each bead. It was devotional service, chanting and stringing your beads for initiation. Every time they knotted another bead, it seemed like a momentous event. Prabhupada said that devotees in India chanted at least 64 rounds of beads a day. So here we have Prabhupada. On this side, you'll see Keith, and there is Michael, and there is Jan. So this particular picture, you can see the fatherly relationship Prabhupada had with his disciples. Prabhupada was on his way in January of the coming year. He was invited by Michael and Jan, who Prabhupada had sent to San Francisco. And he was going to get on the airplane. So Jan, or Janaki, she didn't want Prabhupada to go. So she stole Prabhupada's ticket or passport. And she said, "Oh, Prabhupada, we can't find your ticket." So she was joking with Prabhupada, and you see Prabhupada laughing because they didn't want Prabhupada to leave. So very loving relationship because they really understood how Prabhupada had saved their lives. Saying the Hare Krishna mantra once on each of the 108 beads constituted one round. His spiritual master had said that anyone who didn't chant 64 rounds a day was fallen. At first, some of the boys thought that they would also have to chant 64 rounds, and they became perplexed. That would take all day. How could you go to a job if you had to chant 64 rounds? How could anyone chant 64 rounds? They had never even chanted one round before. Then someone said Swamiji had told him that 32 rounds a day would be a sufficient minimum for the West. Wally said he had heard Swamiji say 25, but even that seemed impossible. Then Prabhupada offered the rock bottom minimum, 16 rounds a day without fail. Whoever got initiated would have to promise. So we can understand then that when Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati gave Diksha, his standard was much higher. He had greater expectations from his disciples. But Srila Prabhupada, according to his Prabhu Datta Desh, which was the Western countries, the Mlechas and the Yavanas, completely ignorant of the standard of Vaishnav culture, Prabhupada, for his initiation, he reduced that standard to minimum 16 rounds a day. The bead stringing, chanting, reading, and dozing went on until 11 at night, when everyone was invited up to Swamiji's room. Okay, I'm just going to read a little bit about what they went through. Just a second. Okay, here we go. The Swamiji looked out at his audience. This is from Mukunda Goswami's book. "If you can't fast all day, then you can eat some sugar candy," he said, and he picked up his small African drum and began to chant. Jan looked over her shoulder at me and got up and came to the back of the room. "How are you feeling?" she asked me. "Pretty terrible," I answered. "I don't think I can make it." "What the hell is sugar candy?" asked Charlie, the flute player. Charlie became Achyuta, who was leaning against the wall next to me. "Damned if I know," I said. "Maybe he means rock candy." "Does it matter? Anything will do. The Swami said if we can't fast all day." "Let's get some," he interrupted. "I can't make it till midnight either. I feel sick." "I'll go," Jan said. "I don't feel that bad. I'll get it." I need some air anyway. Okay, you got money? Okay, go. But don't be long, we're dying in here. It was an hour and a half later when she came back with 3 packets of lifesavers. Lifesavers are lozenges. They're little round, like this, with a hole in the middle. They're called lifesavers in America. They really were lifesavers in this situation. That sugar candy, I asked? Charlie looked skeptical too. Well, it's sugar and it's candy, she shot back. They'd never heard of rock candy. That's the clear, crystal, sugary stuff, I think. They said I'd have to go to Midtown and look around. They thought a place called Stover's on 53rd Street, and they were down at 1st and 2nd Street. She'd have to go 50 blocks to find rock candy. Might have it. But I'm too weak to hunt for it, and a bus to Midtown is just too much today. It's hot out. Here you go. Sitting cross-legged on the rug, I quietly broke open one of the lifesaver packs. I hope the person sitting in front of me obscured me from the Swami's view. So this is during Prabhupada's class. I pretended I was scratching my face like this and eased a yellow lemon-flavored one into my mouth as inconspicuously as possible. I passed a red one to Charlie, who did the same. The sugar candy perked us up a bit. And before I knew it, the afternoon had passed and it was 7 o'clock. The heat had become bearable and it was starting to get dark. We had been in the temple with the Swami for 12 hours straight. About 8:30, 2 Indian couples in their 30s arrived at the temple. They opened the door without knocking and sat down cross-legged on the floor as if they had been invited and were supposed to be there. The men were dressed in Western clothing, black pants and sports jacket, but the women wore brightly colored saris. From his seat at the head of the temple, the Swami smiled and nodded to them. They nodded back. The Swami said something loud to them in Hindi, and one of the men replied in an equally loud voice. Then unexpectedly, the Swami turned to us. So I would like to invite the young devotees of Krishna present here to speak something of their realizations of Krishna consciousness. Ray, can you speak something about Krishna consciousness? What you have realized. Ray looked surprised, and his face went white. After about half a minute and 3 loud throat clears, he said, well, I like the philosophy, and I like the atmosphere too. I think I'd like to dedicate myself more to Krishna. I'm not the body, and heat and cold can't affect me like they used to. This chanting is a way of life. We're not the body, and materialism is not good for us. I think anyone who wants to get high can do it without drugs by chanting. Well, it makes you feel good, and it's legal. That's what I like about it. Also, it doesn't cost anything. That's another good thing about it. He nodded his head, looking straight at the Swami, signaling that his speech was over. Then the Swami looked at Charlie. Mr. Charlie, speak something about your realizations of Krishna consciousness. After a long silence, Charlie swallowed, closed his eyes like the Swami did. He said, well, I'm not a very good speaker, but anyway, Krishna consciousness is, a way to be peaceful inside. You don't have to look for a place, outside yourself. You're not the body, so that's it. Yeah, you can be satisfied. Yes, satisfied to know you don't have to get, all worked up. To do anything. They were getting initiated the next day. He opened his eyes, looked around at the audience, then at the Swami, and then at the round picture of Radha and Krishna on the wall, and then back to the Swami. Then he closed his eyes again. It's like being peaceful all the time. So, chanting, does it. I think it'll work, okay, for anyone. Anyone who tries it. So we're not these bodies. That's what it is, So if everyone tries it, it works. You have to try it, though. I mean, don't be afraid. Just try and you'll see, It really works. And I think, well, that's it. He put his head down and looked at the floor. Miss Denise, you can speak something about Krishna consciousness. So it goes on and on like this. Prabhupada was testing them all, how much they understood of the philosophy. And then he asked the Indian gentleman who came in to speak. Now the Indians, they had just seen, they were walking down the street and they looked in the window and it looked like India inside. So they just spontaneously walked into the temple and sat down. They were merchant marines. Just like what Prabhupada came on that type of a boat. They were merchant marines. So the Indian man, he stood up, and for 5 minutes, he started chanting Dharma Kshetra, Kurukshetra, Samayata, Yutsava. He knew the whole Bhagavad-Gita. So for 5 minutes, he chanted slokas, and then Prabhupada thanked him. So this was their first Janmashtami for everyone. And yes, in the early days, this is how we spent Janmashtami, because we didn't have deities. So we would just spend the whole day trying to chant from morning till night until the feast at night. And it was Prabhupada who cooked the feast for everyone that day. The bead stringing, chanting, reading, and dozing went on till 11 at night, when everyone was invited up to Swamiji's room. As they filed through the courtyard, they sensed an unusual calm in the atmosphere. And Houston Street, just over the wall, was quiet. There was no moon. As his followers sat on the floor, contentedly eating prasadam from paper plates, Swamiji sat among them, telling stories about the birth of Lord Krishna. Krishna had appeared on this evening 5,000 years ago. He was born the son of Vasudeva and Devaki in the prison of King Kamsa at midnight, and his father, Vasudeva, immediately took him to Vrindavan, where he was raised as the son of Nanda Maharaj, a cowherd man. So, what did the devotees have at that time? They had Srila Prabhupada. They had no books whatsoever except for Prabhupada's 3 volumes of Srimad Bhagavatam. And those Srimad Bhagavatams, they didn't describe, in the first canto, you don't have the life of Sri Krishna. You have to go all the way to the 10th canto to get to that. They didn't have Krishna book. And in fact, when Prabhupada was giving his lectures at 72nd Street, he even asked one of the ladies, have you ever seen a picture of Krishna? So really, the devotees hardly knew who Krishna was. And on this night of Janmashtami, Prabhupada, because they would be up for the whole rest of the night after the feast, Prabhupada started telling the story of Krishna's birth. So we spent one Janmashtami once with Prabhupada at New Vrindavan. And Prabhupada's here also in Vrindavan and New Vrindavan, Prabhupada would do the same thing on Janmashtami nights. He would have the devotees all sit together in the temple. We'd all crush in to be with Prabhupada, and it would be very hot. And he would have us read from Krishna book, starting at the beginning of Krishna book and just read on and on and on until Prabhupada would look around and see that everybody was so tired and so hungry. And then he'd say, okay, that's enough, take prasadam. And where there were deities, for instance, here this Janmashtami that Prabhupada spent, the temple wasn't open yet. There were no deities. So we just had the feast and then went to sleep and then got up for Prabhupada's Vyasa Puja. In New Vrindavan, where they had, Prabhupada had installed Radha Vrindavan Chandra, they had beautiful artik at midnight, and they dressed Krishna very nicely. They were already, that was in 1972, so it was already quite developed how we celebrate Janmashtami. Prabhupada also spoke of the necessity of purification for spiritual advancement. It's not enough merely to chant holy words, he said. One must be pure inside and out. Chanting in purity brings spiritual advancement. The living entity becomes impure because he wants to enjoy material pleasure. But the impure can become pure by following Krishna, by doing all works for Krishna. Beginners in Krishna consciousness have a tendency to relax their efforts in a short time. But to advance spiritually, you must resist this temptation and continually increase your efforts and devotion. So sometimes when we first come to Krishna consciousness, everything is so ecstatic, so wonderful, we're so happy, we want to do everything. That's because it's an awakening from our previous life, because we understand that from lifetime to lifetime, Bahunam Janmanam Ante Jnanavamam Prabhadyante Vasudeva Saramiti Samahatma Sudurlava. So after many, many births, we're going through a process of purification. Whatever purification we had in the previous lifetime, in this lifetime, we're able to pick up at that point and go forward. So when we come in contact with the association of devotees, we're very happy because we come immediately to that place where we had left off in our previous life. But then to make advancement beyond that point, that takes effort. So that's why Srila Prabhupada, he says there's a tendency to relax our effort, because it's wonderful in the beginning, you're so happy, everything's so wonderful, but when you have to start making more advancement, then we lose our enthusiasm because it's difficult. So this is what Prabhupada was warning against. Michael Grant. I first heard about the initiation just one day before it was to take place. I had been busy with my music and hadn't been attending. I was walking down 2nd Avenue with one of the prospective initiates, and he mentioned to me that there was going to be something called an initiation ceremony. So he was walking with Ray. I asked what it was about, and he said, "All I know is it means that you accept the spiritual master as God." This was a big surprise to me, and I hardly knew how to take it. But I didn't take it completely seriously, and the way it was mentioned to me in such an offhand way made it seem not very important. He asked me very casually whether I was going to be involved, and I, also being very casual about it, said, "Well, I think I will. Why not? I'll give it a try." So because Michael was a musician, when Prabhupada lived at the Bowery, Michael was one of his top supporters and attendees, and it was Michael who found the 26 2nd Avenue storefront for Prabhupada and the apartment. But because it was a 10-block walk from where he lived, he didn't attend very much because he had to play in a band all night long. And then he'd come home and have to sleep in the morning time. So he didn't get to attend the classes much. He had kind of lost contact with Prabhupada. Jan didn't think she would make an obedient disciple, and initiation sounded frightening. She liked the Swami, especially cooking with him, but it was Mike who convinced her. He was going, so she should come along with him, because they were living together as husband and wife. In America, it's called common law marriage. They're not actually married, but they're living as husband and wife. Carl Jurgens knew something about initiation from his readings, and he, more than the others, knew what a serious commitment it was. He was surprised to hear that Swamiji was offering initiation, and he was cautious about entering into it. He knew that initiation meant no illicit sex, intoxication, or meat-eating. An initiated disciple would have new responsibilities for spreading the teachings to others. Carl was already feeling less involved since the Swami had moved to 2nd Avenue, but he decided to attend the initiation anyway. So we can remember from when Prabhupada had to vacate the loft because Paul Murray had misbehaved, and Prabhupada took shelter at Carl's apartment. He lived there for like 2 weeks. And Carl's wife resented Prabhupada's presence. She also resented Prabhupada's influence on her husband because she was herself a meat eater, and they took intoxication, and there was no question of not having sex because that's what couples do. You know, that's why they live together. So she felt that Prabhupada was a real imposition on their lifestyle. And she was very happy when Prabhupada left. But Carl, he was very interested in Prabhupada's teachings. And he would go every night to hear Prabhupada when they lived at the Bowery, when Prabhupada lived at the Bowery. So now that Carl heard that there was an opportunity to take something more formal, he decided to take part. Bill Epstein had never professed to be a serious disciple. Holding initiation was just another part of the Swami's scene, and you were free to take it seriously or not. He figured it was all right to take initiation, even if you weren't serious. He would try it. So we remember that Bill Epstein was the person who worked at the Paradox Macrobiotic restaurant. And it was he who influenced a lot of young people to both go uptown to see Prabhupada at 72nd Street, and he very much influenced Prabhupada to come and live on the Lower East Side. So Bill was Prabhupada's well-wisher, but he never pretended to be serious about spiritual life. He would come, do a little service, and we read a few weeks ago, then he would go out, take walks, and look for cigarettes to smoke and things like that. So he wasn't really taking the process seriously, but he liked Prabhupada. Karol Bikar was surprised to hear that some people would be taking initiation, even though they had no intentions of giving up their bad habits. She had stopped coming around regularly ever since the Swami had moved, and she felt no desire to ask for initiation. The Swami probably wouldn't initiate women anyway, she figured. So Carol, she would help Prabhupada with cooking. She was the girlfriend of Carl's brother, so they were all interrelated. But when Carol would go to 26 Second Avenue to hear Prabhupada, she saw that it was a different class of young people who were now following Prabhupada. They were very exhibitive of their dancing and their ecstasies, and it wasn't like that on the Bowery. It was musicians and artists who were into the music and into a different type of Krishna consciousness that these young new followers that were following Prabhupada. So she didn't feel that she fit into the 26 Second Avenue group, so she stopped coming. And she also suspected that Prabhupada wouldn't accept female disciples, though of these first 11, he did accept Jan or Janaki, and later he accepted other women. So Prabhupada didn't have any discrimination against men or women. It was really up to the individual whether they felt that they were serious about spiritual life. Robert Nelson hadn't forgotten the Swami and always liked to help whenever he could. But except for an occasional friendly visit, he had stopped coming. He mostly stayed to himself. He still lived uptown and wasn't into the Lower East Side scene. So Robert was one of Prabhupada's first students in uptown, and he would try to get Prabhupada to get his books published, try to get a record made. He was one of Prabhupada's early associates, But once Prabhupada moved from uptown to the Lower East Side, he wasn't actively associating or taking part in Prabhupada's activities, so he did not take initiation. James Green thought he wasn't pure enough to be initiated. He was the art instructor at the Cooper Union, one of the colleges, a free college. Who am I to be initiated? But the Swami had asked him to bring something over to the storefront. I came, and it was just understood that I was supposed to be initiated. So I thought, why not? Stanley had been chanting regularly again and had come out of his crazy mood. So we heard about Stanley last week when Prabhupada was preparing for Mr. Bogart to come. Prabhupada was busy upstairs cooking for Mr. Bogart, and he asked Stanley to make sure nobody came up. So when Mr. Bogart came, he wouldn't let Mr. Bogart go upstairs. And Prabhupada was so disappointed that Stanley, he was ready to commit suicide. You all heard about this last week? Yes? No? Okay. So Stanley, can I have one of those little pillows, please? Yeah, thank you. Stanley went to Prabhupada. Thank you. And he asked Prabhupada for $50. And Prabhupada said, why do you want $50? He said, well, I want to buy some gasoline. And Prabhupada said, well, you have to ask Brahmananda. So Brahmananda was he was leading the devotees at that time. So Brahmananda said, we don't have $50, Prabhupada. And Prabhupada said, you see, we don't have the money, I'm sorry. So then Stanley left. And Prabhupada said, I thought he was crazy because gasoline doesn't, why do you want the gasoline? I want to burn myself up. So Stanley felt very, very sorry that he had disappointed Prabhupada due to his craziness, and he left. Prabhupada sent him back to his mother. His mother knew that Stanley had problems, and the only reason that his mother allowed Stanley to stay with Prabhupada was because Prabhupada promised that he would take personal care of Stanley. But after that incident with Mr. Bogart, Prabhupada sent him back to his mother. So then he became sane again, and he came back and started associating with the devotees again. And he was interested in taking initiation from Prabhupada. He asked his mother if he could be initiated, and she said it would be all right. Steve wanted more time to think about it. Keith was in the hospital. Bruce had only been attending for a week or two. Bruce was Brahmananda. He had just found out about Prabhupada a week before, and it was too soon. He didn't even know that the initiations were going on because he was such a new student. Chuck was on a week's vacation from the regulated spiritual life at the temple, so he didn't know about the initiation. Sometimes I would take breaks. Now we have, these are excerpts from the books that Satsvarup Maharaj and Mukunda Goswami wrote. I added them in so we could hear their inner thoughts. Steve, when the first initiation was to be held, I decided I was not ready. I consoled myself that if I stayed home and did Swamiji's typing instead of receiving initiation, that would not be so bad. There's nothing wrong if I don't become initiated, I thought. This is also a fit engagement. So already Steve he was typing Prabhupada's manuscripts, like a lifetime worth of typing he had. So when he wasn't at his job working, he would take those manuscripts and he would sit in a lotus position and type. So he decided to just type all day that day instead of taking initiation. I knew I should probably have gone to the initiation, but I had withdrawn because of my old neurosis, thinking I was not paid enough personal attention. I also did not want to surrender my life to Krishna just yet. Michael, initiation was the next logical step. If the Swami was offering, I didn't feel that I could or should miss out on the opportunity. And if it didn't work out, nothing would really be lost. I think I'd like to, I said to Ray. Well, do you want us to get you some beads? Sure. And I'll ask Jan what she thinks about getting initiated. So maybe get some for her too, just in case. No one was asked to shave his head or even cut his hair or change his dress. No one offered Prabhupada. See, this is Ray. So they still looked like hippies. And Prabhupada didn't give any restrictions other than that they chant and attend the classes, and he would give the restrictions after the initiation. No one offered Prabhupada the traditional Guru Dakshina, the donation a disciple is supposed to offer as a gesture of his great obligation to his master. Hardly anyone even relieved him of his chores. So Swamiji himself had to do most of the cooking and other preparations for the initiation. He was perfectly aware of the mentality of his boys, and he didn't try to force anything on anyone. Some of the initiates didn't know until after the initiation, when they had inquired, that the 4 rules, no meat eating, no illicit sex, no intoxication, and no gambling, were mandatory for all disciples. Prabhupada's reply then was, I'm very glad that you are finally asking me that. So Srila Prabhupada, it wasn't until November that Prabhupada put up 2 signs. When we get to November, we've been in July, August, September for about 6 months now. So in November, Prabhupada put up signs about the rules. Before that, very gradually, as they realized, then he would introduce the rules to them. It was to be a live Vedic sacrifice with a ceremonial fire right there in the front room of Swamiji's apartment. In the center of the room was a sacrificial arena, a platform of bricks 4 inches high and 2 feet square, covered with a mound of dirt. The dirt was from the courtyard, and the bricks were from a nearby gutted building. Around the mound were 11 bananas, because after the fire sacrifice, each initiate offers 1 banana into the fire. Clarified butter, sesame seeds, whole barley grains, 5 colors of powdered dyes, and a supply of kindling, that's wood. The 11 initiates took up most of the remaining space in the front room as they sat on the floor, knee to knee around the sacrificial arena. The guests in the hallway peered curiously through the open door. For everyone except the Swami, this was all new and strange, and every step of the ceremony took place under his direction. When some of the boys had made a mess trying to apply the Vaishnav tilak to their foreheads, Prabhupada had patiently guided his finger up their foreheads, making a neat, narrow V. So these are the 11 devotees who got initiated that day. Michael Grant became Mukunda, Jan became Janaki, James Green became Jagannath, Ray became Rairam, Carl became Karlapati, Howard became Hayagriva, Robert Lefkowitz became Rabindra Sarup, Wally became Umapati, Stanley became Striadish, and the other 2 were Satyavrata and Janardhan. Satyavrata and Janardhan, he later went to Montreal and opened a temple there for Prabhupada. And Satyavrata, maybe we'll hear about him later. I don't know much about him. He might have left early in the movement. Okay, thank you very much. We look forward to next week. Hare Krishna. Jai.